SPLM, Sudan People's Liberation Movement, that is the ruling party in South Sudan, has done something that's brilliant. I'm not sure what they've done to the political parties that are led by brilliant men. They've somehow, I don't want to say they've hoodwinked them to agree to something that is basically a violation of the peace agreement. But what they've done is brilliant, and you will see shortly.
President Salva Kiir Mayardit on Wednesday convened a high-level meeting with leaders of various political parties to discuss on the conclusion of the transitional period and the preparations for the conduct of general elections as outlined in the extended roadmap.
So what does this mean in the context of the revitalized peace agreement? It means that the agreement has been completely dismantled. So we cannot talk anymore about any peace agreement. It is done. Now, I know there's one faction that is missing, the one that is allied to Dr. Riek Machar, who is now under court proceedings. And the faction that is led by Stephen Parkwall is completely allied and has agreed with what they've discussed. So that's what it means. Now, let's listen to what the SPLM Secretary General says about the agreement and what he says about what they've agreed in the context of elections and census and the constitution, the new constitution. Remember, the country doesn't have a permanent constitution. We are going the way of Sudan. For those of you who may not know, Sudan did not have a permanent constitution until 1973, after the Addis Ababa Agreement. Remember, Sudan became independent in 1956. So from 1956 to 1973, Sudan did not have a permanent constitution. So South Sudan still doesn't have a permanent constitution. So let's see what the Secretary General, Dr. Akol Polkodi, is saying.
Particular provision of the R-ARCSS so that the election could be conducted as agreed in the extended roadmap in December 2026. Second, the parties also agreed to refer the pending and the ongoing provision of R-ARCSS as post-R-ARCSS program to be implemented by newly elected government after the election.
So what he's basically saying is that there are provisions within the revitalized peace agreement that have not been implemented. So what they've agreed as political parties is that these provisions will be implemented after the elections. So the new government that will be elected will now decide to implement these provisions. But we have to remember what they've agreed today is the end of the transitional period. So we're not talking anymore about any agreement. So after the elections, we are not talking about the revitalized peace agreement. So we are not talking about the provisions. I think they will be reworded differently because the new government will not have any obligations to look back at the revitalized peace agreement unless if they feel these provisions are fundamental to their own governance. But I don't think we will talk about these provisions anymore. I think we will forget about whatever they are. So that's basically what he's saying, because we'll have a new government, whatever that form is. And we know the elections will not be free and fair, but we will have a new government. So these provisions he's talking about, which he described as post-R-ARCSS agreement, there will be the post-agreement provisions. No one is going to implement them. So let's see what else he's saying within this context.
That means that it's not possible, as we did with CPA, to implement any agreement 100%.
He's right. It's not feasible to implement any agreement 100%. So we can agree with him on that. And this is something I've stressed to SPLM-IO officials who tend to believe that all the provisions of the agreement must be implemented for anything to move forward. So that is unrealistic. It's utopian. But we have to remember this. When he brings in the CPA was not implemented in full because of the intransigence of the National Congress Party of Umar al-Bashir. So they refused to implement some provisions intentionally because they wanted to sabotage the referendum. Now, when he brings in this, the agreement was not implemented because of what? It's because of the SPLM in government that acted exactly like NCP. They dragged their feet. They did not want to implement the agreement. So the agreement was not implemented 100% because of SPLM that is led now by President Kiir and him as Secretary General. So the problem is we cannot just make these statements as if we don't know where they're coming from. So to bring in the CPA is somehow misleading because we know who to blame for the CPA, why we don't have the referendum in ABA, why we didn't have the popular consultation for Southern Blue Nile and then also Southern Kordofan. Why? Because we know. It's the same thing with SPLM now. They are to blame. So for Dr. Akol to throw this in is concerning for me. All right. So let's see what else he says.
So those provisions that are not implemented shall be implemented after the election.
I've already mentioned earlier that saying that these provisions will be implemented after the elections is not right, because the agreement is already finalized. They've already ended the transitional period. By the time of elections next year, the transitional period will have ended. So we are not implementing any provisions anymore. It is just the new government that is going to strategize on what it is going to do. So what are these provisions he's talking about that will be implemented after the agreement?
The permanent constitution, conduct of census, and many other reform programs shall be referred and considered as post-R-ARCSS program to be implemented by the newly elected government.
So one of the things they've done to the revitalized peace agreement is that they made some amendment. So that was the purpose of the meeting by all the parties to the agreement. And the amendment is to allow them to postpone the census. So the elections will be conducted without any census. The last census that was conducted was, I'm not sure, 2010, 2008, 2010. Also the constitution making process. So the elections will be conducted without any constitution, without any census. So which is really troubling. So they saw the constitutional making process and the census as obstacles to the conduct of elections. So they are prioritizing elections as if elections are good in themselves. Elections are a tool for the democratization of the country to the improvement of governance. But when you postpone the most fundamental elements of governance in the country because you prioritize elections, is to put things upside down, is to put a cart before a horse, because the constitution and the census, they guide the elections, but that's not what they've done. So they've now postponed them, and he's speaking of them as provisions of the agreement to be implemented after the elections. But after the elections, there will no longer be provisions. There will be new strategies. So these are the three things he's talking about: the census and the constitution making process. And then the third one is what he called political reforms. And who is going to be in charge of these reforms? Here's what he says.
The third point, that the parties also agreed to form a political committee that will deal with the political issues of the constituencies, post-R-ARCSS programs, political parties' conduct during the election, among many other things.
These provisions will be taken care of by what he calls the political committee that will be formed, I guess, by all the parties. So it will be composed of all the political parties. And the task of this political committee is to deal with political issues that will arise after the elections. And then the other one is the post-agreement issues that were outstanding, which he calls provisions. And then the third one is the conduct of political parties during the election process. But because the elections are conducted and supervised by the electoral committee, I'm not sure why we need a political committee to be able to deal with the conduct of political parties. There's also a process in place. So the Electoral Commission should be able to supervise the conduct of political parties. So I think he needs to clarify how this political committee will work alongside the Election Commission, because that is the one that is in charge of the conduct of political parties. So there are some things that they will need to clarify, because we also need to see a written document to be able to understand some of the things he's saying. So there are a lot of things that have been discussed. We need an official communique. So that is the task of the political committee. There's another committee that he's talking about, and let's see what he says about that.
So parties also agreed to form a legal committee to be headed by the Minister of Justice, and task of this committee is to oversee and effect the proposed amendment.
Okay, so now this is the heart of the meeting. This committee is the one that is the heart of the meeting. So without amending the agreement, then they will not be able to go forward with the elections without the permanent constitution and without the census. So they wanted to get around this problem by forming this committee. So the Minister of Justice is going to lead this committee, and they will look at the provision and to amend it in a way that will not reflect them as having violated the agreement. Now, we know they've violated the agreement, but because they've conducted it in a brilliant way, where they will give us the impression that all the parties to the agreement, including the SPLM-IG, have agreed to amend this provision to ensure that elections are conducted without a permanent constitution and without a national census. We know the faction that is allied with Dr. Riek Machar is not part of this. So they will say the agreement has been violated because the central figure, the figure that is mentioned in the agreement, is not part of that. But what they've done is that they've brought all the parties together. And I don't think they have a choice. Anyway, if you live in Juba, you don't have a choice if the president calls you. So that's the task of this committee. Now, what are the details of what this is going to do?
And this proposed amendment, to be very specific, are basically three or two. One, delink the process of constitution making from the conduct of election. Two, delink the conduct of new census from the election process. This will enable the parties to proceed and hold elections on time as promised when the agreement was extended.
What do all this mean? At least something is happening. Maybe that's the silver lining. Something is happening. We were in some sort of a political stagnation, but something is happening. It may be something we don't like, but at least something is happening. But it also means that SPLM-IG does and acts when it wants to. So look at what they have done. Look at how they have brought all the political parties together, because that is something in their interest. But when it came to the provision of the actual agreement, they did not want to act. So if they wanted to implement this agreement, they could have implemented it. If they wanted to end the trial, the needless trial of Dr. Riek Machar, they would have done it. So this is something that is sad, that is very ominous. So it also points to how the political parties came together. I do not believe for a second that all the political parties, including the FDs, including the party of Dr. Lemakol, even including the SPLM-IG, actually like what the government is doing. So they've been enticed or maybe forced or intimidated into accepting a condition like this to amend. It's not amending, it's actually abrogating, but they're using some sort of legalistic language to sound that they are within the parameters of the implementation of the agreement. That's what they're trying to do, forming a legal committee to look at this provision and delink all the things they consider obstacles to the elections. But why do you think they prioritize elections as opposed to a permanent constitution and the census? And the census is applicable beyond the elections. It is what ministries used to provide services, to allocate resources. Without the census, then the government will not be able to allocate resources. But I don't think the government is interested in allocating resources. The people do not really count, and the elections will not be free and fair. But here's the reason why they prioritize elections. They want legitimacy. Even if the elections are not going to be free and fair, they will tell the world, they will tell South Sudanese, we were elected. The president is going to say, I am elected. So the question of legitimacy may still be raised, but they will have a ground, however shaky, to say we were elected. Now we can say they are not elected because the elections were conducted when we were part of Sudan in 2010. So these were elections in a different country. Since South Sudan became independent in 2011, we've never had elections in independent South Sudan. So they want legitimacy very badly. Now, the other thing is, I'm not sure whether they will have elections at the federal level, at the state level, at the local level. I'm not sure. When I talked to Dr. Ting Mayai, who is the chair of the Bureau of Statistics, and that is the institution that is tasked with the conduct of the national census, he gave them some options. And one of the options is to only conduct elections at the presidential level and then maybe at the federal level, and not at the local level. So I'm not sure what kind of elections they will conduct. So we need more details. My hope is to be able to talk to Dr. Akol Paul Kodid to iron these things out and to also talk about SPLM as a party, because many South Sudanese have become disenchanted with SPLM. And the departure of Nial Deng Nial is also a stain on the historical legacy of SPLM. So they can say all these things, they can force all these political parties to agree to what they want. But at the end of the day, what's the future like? What's the future like? Recently, in the meeting yesterday during the meeting, Elias Lomoro is from a different political party, and he said that his party is not going to field a presidential candidate because President Kiir is their candidate. President Kiir is from SPLM and Lumoro is not from the SPLM. It's the kind of political atmosphere they are trying to build, what Dr. Isaac Gang calls a one-party system. So thank you. For those of you who have not subscribe to the channel. And on Saturday, I'll be talking to two outstanding women, and we'll be discussing feminism and patriarchy. We may also talk about bride price and polygamy, but that will be up to the guests. So we'll talk about that. So look forward to that. I'm also working on another session on climate, environment, and health. So I have some guests. So this is also a conversation that is coming up. So thank you. Do not forget to subscribe and support the channel, share, comment. Thank you.